Let's think about how the democratic process is supposed to work, and in particular, how laws are supposed to be made in Parliament. When a law is made, it's supposed to be voted upon in the House of Representatives and then debated and voted upon in the Senate. If there's amendments, they should go back and forth between the House and the Senate as applicable in order to resolve and debate and decide upon those amendments. Often, a piece of legislation will go to a committee for it to be evaluated, to get public feedback, and then potentially incorporate that feedback into the piece of legislation. That's how it's supposed to work. However, this all falls apart if the government of the day manages to procure a shortcut, and in particular, if the ALP and Anthony Albanese at the moment manage to short-circuit the committee process, or short-circuit the public consultations, or short-circuit the debate in Parliament. And that is exactly what has happened recently, and happened across all of these areas. And let's talk about that in a little bit more detail, and of course, let me know your thoughts about this process in the comments below. So a clear case in point is the move to ban under 16s from using social media. The bill has been relatively controversial. I've talked about it in prior videos, and I'm not going to go through what I said before, but suffice it to say, not everyone was on board. And it was opposed from people ranging from the Free Speech Union through to the Australian Human Rights Commission. There was, in general terms, rejections about it from the left and the so-called right, meaning that people weren't really on board. People wanted more time for this particular piece of legislation to be debated and refined to make sure that if it were going to go through, it wasn't going to invade people's privacy and require all Australians to provide ID in order to use social media. Now, there are a couple of problems with the consultation process. First, Anthony Albanese and the ALP only allowed 1 day for the public to send in their particular views on the legislation. And when they sent in their reports, people could only make a submission of 1 to 2 pages. Now, of course, some large companies ignored that and made submissions that were much longer, but nevertheless they said 1 to 2 pages. Now, you immediately see the problem here. You only have 24 hours to make a submission. Many people have jobs and they have families and simply are not going to be turning that around, meaning many people simply had not the opportunity to be able to make a submission. Furthermore, when these submissions were received by the relevant committee, guess how long the committee had to actually go through any of these submissions and do a public hearing? Well, if you guessed 3 hours, you would be correct, because that's exactly what happened. What that in essence means is all these parliamentarians were supposed to consider what turned out to be 15,000 submissions from the public. It is obviously farcical. There's clearly no way that was actually going to be properly considered in an inquiry. Now, that's something that many people, including Senator Matt Canavan, have particularly noted, and he's been particularly irritated by the schmozzle of the process that went through there. And many people in the public have also been irritated, and many of the public submissions to the inquiry also noted that there was only a 1 day turnaround for them to make submissions. And this was not an isolated incident. For example, say we think about the so-called misinformation and disinformation bill. Well, it had a slightly longer public consultation process of 1 week. However, the bill was still itself rather long, and 1 week for people to turn around a submission on a complex piece of legislation is simply not long enough. Furthermore, when they did inquiries, it wasn't entirely clear how they decided who would appear at these inquiries. For example, they appeared to invite people that didn't make a submission in advance, people like Anne Twomey, who is a professor at the University of Sydney, who actually happened to disagree with the bill, but she focuses on constitutional law and had not made a submission, but they invited her nevertheless. Now, this is not to begrudge Anne Twomey, because she actually made a considered statement at the inquiry when she appeared. However, it goes to show that they picked and chose who they were going to actually talk to. It was very clear that that was a sham of a process as well. And again, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying that people who were invited to the inquiry but didn't make a submission did anything wrong. Many of them, in fact, acted in good faith, such as Anne Twomey, and made a valuable contribution. But nevertheless, the process was a disaster. Now, that's the first aspect of it. The public consultation process being a complete sham, and effectively being ignored in many cases. That bill, the misinformation and disinformation bill, was only defeated when it became apparent it was not actually going to get through Parliament. The under 16 ban, however, did, however, get through Parliament. That then leads me to the next issue, which is the consideration of bills in Parliament. Now, like I indicated before, for a full-functioning democratic process to actually work, you need the bills to be considered back and forth in the House of Representatives and the Senate, whereby a bill is refined. That at least is ideally how it's going to work. Clearly, that isn't always how it works. Sometimes bills simply aren't scrutinized properly. In fact, that might happen quite a lot. And sometimes bills simply are flagged through, perhaps as part of some bipartisan agreement, or maybe an agreement that the ALP makes with the Greens in order to get something done on one bill, and then the ALP gives the Greens something on something else. Nevertheless, it's supposed to involve a back and forth where potential amendments are fully considered. However, in the last parliamentary sitting day of 2024, guess what Labor did? Do you think they considered amendments and considered debate? Or do you think they tried to ram through legislation? Let me know what you think happened in the comments below. And many of you might have followed this, because it turns out the ALP, in combination with the Greens, decided to guillotine debate on over 30 bills. What guillotining debate means is they simply cut off debate. There's simply no more debate to be had on those bills, and they're flagged through effectively, put straight to the vote. Now, this occurred for 30 bills. Now, think about this for a moment. How on earth are you supposed to actually consider 30 pieces of legislation in one day? Now, even if you just read out the title of the bill and do a short discussion of it, that alone takes quite a bit of time. It's not exactly instantaneous. So that means that even if you're affording even just 15 minutes to each individual bill, you'd be there for at least 7 hours in consideration just doing a bare cursory analysis of these bills, let alone actually a debate. It's a complete farce to think about the idea that they tried to ram through more than 30 bills in one parliamentary sitting day. It clearly shows that there was no proper consideration of these.
A whole generation has been activated by this process. There is a silver lining here, perhaps. Right now, a guy called Mr. Anthony Kaloof is running a live stream of our broadcast here. He has 38,000 people watching. The official YouTube channel of Parliament has 800. He's got 38,000 young people absolutely pissed off with this Parliament right now watching. They are totally angry, and those people are going to grow up. And they're going to keep voting. And I think there's going to be a lot of change coming to our Parliament years to come if we keep ignoring those people like we are tonight.
Now, the Liberal Party, or the Coalition, has some blame to shoulder in relation to this, but not the complete blame. The reason I say that is the ALP was able to guillotine debate in combination with the Greens. They were able to shut off debate by lining up with the Greens to just shut it off, doing a deal with the Greens, which is an indication of what will happen in a minority government if the ALP is in alignment with the Greens and forms effectively a coalition with the Greens to get things done. It is very clear we'll get more deals like this. It's something that we clearly would want to avoid. So to give you an example of some of the deals that were done in relation to this guillotine motion and getting the bills through, the Greens were able to procure some amendments to things such as the housing plan, but also the Greens were able to do some more surreptitious things that didn't really get headlines, but nevertheless were a little bit damaging. One, for example, is the Greens were able to procure amendments to how Export Finance Australia would operate. Export Finance Australia is effectively an independent government-linked organisation that goes around funding offshore projects or overseas projects or expansion projects. It's effectively there to try to facilitate, in some cases, Australian companies expanding overseas, hopefully to generate economic prosperity for Australians as a result, growing the economic pie. And in return, Export Finance Australia is supposed to get a commercial return for doing this. In essence, they're providing funding to facilitate business activities. It's quite a good process in general, and it's something that should occur because effectively there's a win-win here. Australia and the Australian taxpayers and the Australian people can get a commercial return for things that potentially should be funded, and Export Finance Australia is to be run on an arm's-length, independent, professional manner. And many Australian businesses can get access to some more funding that might not otherwise be able to get access to due to capital rationing. It's supposed to operate quite well. But guess what the Greens managed to procure? Now, Export Finance Australia will no longer be able to provide funding to oil and gas projects, for example, or fossil fuel projects. What that means is the Greens have now hamstrung a core part of Export Finance Australia, which had been doing some of those activities. And some of those activities are very core to Australia's energy security, or indeed global energy provision, as we saw with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where when oil and gas became an issue, energy prices started to go up. This appears to be something that either the Greens didn't realise, or more likely simply don't care about, in their pursuit of ideological purity. So clearly there was some horse trading between the ALP and the Greens in order to procure a shortcut process for many of the bills to go through Parliament. To give you an example of what the ALP supposedly gained from this, the ALP was able to procure changes to how the RBA would operate. The RBA would then have both a monetary policy board and a governance board. Now, the monetary policy board would be there to determine what would happen to interest rates, to set interest rates in a supposedly professional manner. Now, in some ways, having that split board is a good thing, something that the Centre of Independent Studies, for example, had advocated for. Now, that in theory is good, because in theory, you get people who know what they are talking about with the economy, making decisions about what is going on in the economy by having external experts on the RBA board. However, emphasis here is in theory, because what actually happens is the legislation vests control over the appointments in the Treasurer. So Jim Chalmers can decide who he wants to appoint to the RBA boards, meaning he can appoint ideological friends. Now, if we think about how the board's made up, there currently are 6 external members on the existing RBA board. That's now going to grow to 2 external boards, or 2 boards rather, each of which will have 6 external members, so now 12 external members. The Treasurer can appoint all external members for varying terms of office, meaning Jim Chalmers can now appoint another 6 external members to the board. That is in addition to the existing 2 that he has already appointed. So he will have appointed 8 of the 12 external members. The existing 2 he has appointed are union-affiliated in some respects. They have worked with unions in the past. Now, this is not to besmirch them, because it doesn't appear they've done anything wrong or made any bad decisions necessarily, at least not that I'm aware of. But it does raise the spectre that if Jim Chalmers is trying to exert ideological pressure on people there, that's more easy to do if he's appointed them. Furthermore, it is the case that if he goes around and selects people that agree with him ideologically, they might be inherently more likely to go along with what he wants with interest rates, meaning he might be able to implicitly procure a rate decision that he wants in service of him getting re-elected. I.e., he might try to get an RBA board that will lower interest rates when they should not necessarily do so, just to make Jim Chalmers look good in the short term, even if that ultimately undermines the Australian economy. Now, Jim Chalmers either doesn't understand or is misleading us about inflation, because he has repeatedly said that inflation has been coming down. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics has specifically said that inflation, while at a headline level has moderated a bit, that in large part is due to temporary subsidies that are not going to keep going on, that in many cases have already now ended and are just coming to the end now, and they're now going to work their way out of the system. And in particular, the federal government subsidy is going to end in 12 months, whereupon energy prices will just ratchet back to where they were, creating inflation. Jim Chalmers either doesn't understand that, or he is just going around misleading people about it. Take your pick. Let me know what you think he's doing in the comments below. But if we circle back around to how this means, or what this means to the democratic process, we can see that the ALP has both run a sham of a public consultation process with a sham of a public inquiry that is simply there to supposedly try to provide cover for passing bills that are inherently unpopular, and even then that hasn't really worked because they seem to be just ignoring the public inquiries. And then they ram these bills through the House and the Senate, and they do effectively control the House, but then ram them through the Senate in collaboration with the Greens, cutting off debate, meaning we effectively have a sham of a democratic process. Clearly, the ALP and Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers don't respect the democratic process, because otherwise they would not have tried to ram through more than 30 bills on one parliamentary sitting day with minimal debate. It shows a complete lack of respect for the Australian voter, in my opinion. But let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Do you think the ability to pass 30 pieces of legislation in one day is a massive legislative achievement, or do you think it is a schmozzle? Let me know what you think.